There's a little bit of a contrarian streak in me that said, well, wait a minute, you want to give up on American manufacturing? That sounds like a situation where I'll take the other side and see what happens.
Welcome to Grey Matter. I'm Declan Kelly, founder, chairman, and CEO of Concello. I've spent the last 30 plus years advising the CEOs who are leading the world's top companies. If there's one thing I've learned in that time, the best leaders think differently. That wiring, that grey matter, separates the truly exceptional leaders from everyone else. Understanding it is what allows us at Concello to help the best in the world be even better. This podcast exists because the most accomplished leaders agreed to sit down and talk about something they rarely discuss publicly: how their minds actually work. Larry Culp is one of the most respected CEOs alive. At Danaher, he grew the company from $4 billion to $30 billion over 14 years, while transforming it from an industrial tools business into a healthcare and diagnostics giant. Then came the impossible challenge: GE. In 7 years, he led the greatest industrial turnaround in history. He took GE from $140 billion in debt to stability and then growth, and then split the iconic Conglomerate into 3 industry leaders: GE Aerospace, GE Healthcare, and GE Vernova. Everyone knows the turnaround story. Almost no one knows how Larry's mind processed what everyone else saw as being impossible. This is Grey Matter. Larry Culp, it's great to see you. Thank you for making the time today. Welcome to Grey Matter.
Declan, my pleasure. Good to be with you as always.
Knowing you as long as I have and all the things we've done together, I know that you're a deeply private person and don't do a lot of, in fact, I don't think you've ever done an interview like this. So you're not a man who talks a lot about himself, and I think that's well known. So I appreciate you doing it today. The reason why I wanted to do this interview is, as I've told you over many years, and I think you've kind of shoo-shooed me away every time I've said it, but you are above and beyond, I think, all the others that I've worked with in my life, because of your cerebral nature and also your detail orientation in a way that I've never seen in my career in 34 years. Today, I want to explore what makes that person that person. Thank you for allowing me to try. We'll see if I succeed. So we're sitting here in the Eastern Shore in this beautiful place. Obviously, it means an awful lot to you to be here because you spent so much of your formative years here and your family. Tell me a little bit about why you chose this location for our interview.
I think in a nutshell, Declan, I grew up on the other side, on the Western Shore, but spent a ton of time over here growing up, hunting and fishing with my grandfather, my father, and just really fell in love with the place. My love of the environment, I think, really springs from all my time here. It's a place rich in history, going back to the Revolution. So there's just so many threads that keep bringing me back here. And I think as I sit here today, it's just a lot of great memories with both family and friends that are rooted in the shore. I think it's shaped who I am.
So when you're out there on a boat, is that your happy place? Is that where you're alone? Is that where you get time to think?
Well, it is probably my happy place. I tend to be out on the water fishing. And when I'm fishing, I'm thinking about nothing else. I know fishing can be boring for a lot of people, but even before I'm on the boat, even before I'm on the water, I'm completely locked in. And it's one place I can go and know that I can safely put my brain somewhere else for a few hours or a day and come back to whatever is happening in the office or at home.
You mentioned a moment ago your father and your grandfather. Not many people know this either, but you spent a lot of your early youth in a welding shop that your grandfather had and your father had. That was your first introduction to industrial manufacturing, if we can put it that way. I know you've talked a little bit in the past about there were times when your father even had to work so hard to struggle to make payroll, and you witnessed all that happen and you learned a lot from it. Talk a bit about that if you don't mind. I'd love to know more about that.
Sure. Well, my grandfather founded a welding and machine shop in Silver Spring, Maryland back in 1938. And it was a business that he ran, and then my father and my mother took on after he passed. And it was a very small business, Declan, but I think my interest in business really sprang from all those kitchen table conversations in good times and in bad times. I do remember times that the business didn't make payroll, at least for my parents. And that was really, I think, something that helped me understand not only the importance of the work that the people in the field do every day, right, for a paying customer, but also in turn the importance of taking care of your people. I still have my grandfather's payroll register. It's a prized possession. I don't have many things from my grandfather, but when you read the names in that payroll register, you know that these were individuals, right, who had families whose weekly paycheck was really critical to their well-being. And at the end of the day, even for a GE Aerospace operating at the scale that we do today, that's really important.
Is this sort of a window into how you think? Because when you took over GE almost 7 years ago, very soon it will be 7 years, there was $140 billion in debt. I remember the first night you were appointed, I was there with you. I'm sure there must have been at least one fleeting moment where you cast your mind back to where you came from, because without that mindset, how is it possible to do what you did?
Well, it's hard to believe, Declan. It's been 7 years. But I actually think that in many respects, go back to the spring of 2018. I just come on the board at GE. We had our first annual meeting in Pittsburgh. And what I remember so vividly about that is how many people showed up who worked for the company, who had worked for the company, people on the pension program, other retirees, many of whom were second, third generation GE employees. They were animated, right? They were unhappy with where the company was, but boy, did they care passionately about the company, what it meant to them, their families, dare I say, the country. And I've often thought about that. There again, individuals for whom the company mattered immensely, not unlike my father's business at a much, much smaller scale. And at the end of the day, you really do have to take care of your people, right, in order to take care of the customer. So there's probably a bit of a linkage there for sure.
So you really think that your upbringing was fundamental to how you think and how you operate?
I do. I really do. Again, thinking about the customer first and foremost and taking care of the people that work for you.
So you mentioned basketball a moment ago. So a lot of people may not know that you were a power forward. Basketball in particular was a bit of an obsession for you, and you played it a lot in high school and thereafter. And this concept of continuous improvement was something that really struck you when you were playing it because of the coaches you had and so forth. I'm just trying to get at what you thought about as you became a business leader, because I think some of these formative events in your life early on, while not well known, are probably really important to who you became.
No question. And back in the day, you could be 6'3" and play power forward. You can barely be a point guard at that height today. But I think back, Declan, about everything that I learned growing up playing basketball, being obsessed, as you said. And I will never forget that I had a junior high school coach who said, you have to practice. You either get better or you get worse, but you don't stay the same. And that scared me to death. And it really fueled every hour I put in to practice over time. And the irony was when I ended up learning more about the Toyota production system and this idea of Kaizen, right, operationalizing, continuous improvement, it was the same idea. So I really think that I didn't learn Kaizen at Toyota. I think I learned it back in junior high school in a way that really has shaped my approach. And at the same time, the beautiful thing about basketball is it's a team sport. 5 people on the court, moving the ball around, playing together, playing good defense. That's how you win. That's what I loved about basketball more than anything. Not that I was a great player by any stretch, but just that idea of team, that you play together, you win together, you lose together, was something that was instilled in those formative years that I think has really shaped my approach to business.
Speaking of business, you went to Harvard Business School. I know you were very proud of that, and you should be, because of where you came from and your background and all the things that led you to get there. When you left Harvard Business School, did you intend to become a CEO or leader of a business? Was that within your frame of reference? What were you thinking about when you walked out those doors?
Well, I was thinking about a lot of things, including, gosh, I made it, and that wasn't always a guaranteed outcome. HBS was a humbling experience for me, Declan. It was hard, particularly that first year. I'm sure a lot of people say that. But I think when I graduated, I knew that the reason I went there to become a general manager was a good choice. But I think my aspirations, frankly, were limited. I saw myself perhaps as a functional leader over time. There was a lot still to learn coming out of business school after 2 years. Not in my wildest dreams would I have imagined I would have the opportunities to be a general manager as early as I did at Danaher. I had my first P&L when I was 30, and I think 3 years out of school, let alone getting a chance to be CEO at Danaher and then GE in time.
What people forget is how you got into Danaher. What I find fascinating is this guy comes out of Harvard Business School, doesn't know what he's going to do, picks up a pen and paper and writes to George Sherman and says, what? What did you say in that letter? What did it say?
Coming out of 1990, a lot of people were going to Wall Street. Lots of people were going to consulting. I knew that was not what I wanted to do. But there weren't necessarily a lot of opportunities within industry that were fresh and interesting. So I was on more or less an independent job search at the time. I knew of the success that George had had at Black & Decker, it being a company in Baltimore. Knew a bit about George by reputation. And when he went to Danaher as the first outside CEO, as Steve and Mitch Rails passed the baton, he was talking about doing a lot of things. So in addition to being a company near where I grew up, it was appealing to me to perhaps jump in at a time when a new CEO was starting, not talking about doing one thing, but several things. So I drafted a letter, typewriter, stamps, a lot of old school technology, and sent it to him. And lo and behold, I think it ended up being one of the first pieces of mail he got as he settled into the office in Washington, called me up, said, come on down, would love to meet with you. We hit it off, and the rest is, I guess, history.
What on earth was in the letter? What did you say? Do you remember?
I really don't. It's probably nothing more than you've got a soon-to-be newly minted Harvard MBA who would love to explore being part of this this journey that you've embarked upon.
We're talking about a guy who's running a $4 billion company, at the time or a bit smaller, and he gets a letter and he writes to you and says, come on down and see me. In those days, that was thinkable. Now it's unthinkable. And right now we've got a history and a legacy because he chose to answer that letter. It's quite extraordinary.
Right. Well, and the irony, of course, was George spent the early part of his career at GE working with Jack Welch. So there were a lot of GE influences, I think, in George's professional journey that he brought to Danaher, neither one of us knowing, of course, how things would play out.
And what drew you to industrials in particular, even though then it was an industry in decline back then? I guess you had some exposure to it when you were growing up, but nevertheless, it would have been easy for you to go to different directions. Why did you choose industrials in particular back then?
You go back to the late 80s, 1990, right? The Japanese model was going to overtake the US model. Even the German model was being seen as superior. And there's a little bit of a contrarian streak in me that said, well, wait a minute, you want to give up on American manufacturing? That sounds like a situation where I'll take the other side and see what happens.
So to take that one step further, you became eventually the CEO of the company, I think 10 years later, approximately. It went from 4 billion to 30 billion under your leadership in the space of a very short period of time, another 10 years, 14 years. And you took this industrial company and turned it into a healthcare and diagnostics business, which when you walked through the door would have been unheard of. When did you realize you needed to do that and why?
Well, I think that in many respects, when George and I joined in 1990, we were already beginning to think through the evolution of the portfolio. Danaher at the time was doing a lot of different things, from mechanics hand tools to higher-end instrumentation. In the business that I joined in 1990, Veeder-Root was really one of the first Danaher companies involved in instrumentation. In that business, focused on environmental applications in the retail petroleum sector. And we could see that those higher gross margin businesses tended to have higher R&D, but also a higher organic growth profile. A number of businesses like that operated in highly fragmented markets where our M&A capabilities were relevant. So I think over time, it wasn't as if we made a big decision at a fixed juncture, we're going to go in that direction, but it tended to evolve. And as we built out the environmental business, we looked at some of the adjacent markets, particularly healthcare, and said a lot of the things that have propelled our success in some of these more industrial-oriented and instrumentation businesses likely apply in healthcare. And that's why by the time I became CEO, we were moving in that direction. But I think, again, it's more of a long-term natural evolution in the portfolio and where we could create the most value than a decision I made during my tenure to break right or break left.
But isn't it still very interesting that even though you didn't have naturally a background in several of these areas, that you evolved into them and became an expert in them. Your career is littered with examples of businesses that you didn't know anything about before you walked in, and then you bought them, and then you learned.
You go back to my earliest days at Danaher, and you go back to the fall of 2018 with GE. In many respects, while my approach has probably evolved and gotten better, I'm not sure it's that different fundamentally. I try to read as much as I can about an industry, be it in the press, be it from Wall Street, what have you. But then at the end of the day, I really do like to get out and talk to people, ask questions, and listen aggressively, particularly with people who work for the company, especially those that might not be within vicinity of the boardroom, the people who do the real work day in and day out, and talk to customers. I mean, you can have an honest conversation with a customer about what they really like, but also what maybe they don't like. You can begin to discern where priorities lie, both in terms of fixing problems and seizing opportunities. And I think that's just what has served me very well in the course of maybe doing due diligence on a new business in a new sector at Danaher, let alone how I got myself up the very steep learning curves at GE.
But there is something different about you that separates you from the rest. And again, my humble opinion, you're not saying it, I'm saying it. The detail orientation is off the charts. I always give the phantom example when I talk about you, of you walking down a factory floor. I have this image of you tightening a screw just one turn tighter to make it even tighter. I have sat in meetings with you for hours watching you argue over the placement of a comma. I've been there, I've seen it. And you usually win the argument. In fact, if I'm being honest, you always did. That detail orientation, is that learned? Is that inside you? Is that what you learned growing up? Where did it come from? Because every CEO thinks they're big on detail. I would love them to spend, a day watching you doing it, because it redefines what that means.
I think it probably comes from my earliest days at Danaher. Danaher was small enough and new enough that we didn't have the luxury of coasting at any one point in time, right? There was really no room for PowerPoint and other forms of superficial management, right? It was an approach, it was a culture, it was an operating model that was really substantive. And I think the only way to be substantive is to get down into the detail, whether that be the spec on a new product, to really discern where you're going to differentiate yourself and create real value for a customer, or getting out on the shop floor, right? Finding that screw that may need a quarter turn in order to drive an improvement in a process yield. If you're talking about those things at altitude, you're unlikely to impact them. But if you can develop an understanding at a ground level, it doesn't mean you have to micromanage, but at least you are, what I would describe as managing the substance of things rather than the mere appearance.
And leading by example.
Leading by example, for sure.
So you were asked to be CEO of GE twice before you said yes. Not sure everybody knows that, but that's a fact, right? So the third time they came knocking and said, will you please do this? You've been on the board for 6 months. I was there with you the night you said yes, and we started work the following morning. I'll never forget it. It was early the following morning too, if I remember. What made you say yes the third time? And did you seek counsel from other people? Did you go away and think about it? I know you knew at the time the enormity of what you were being asked, because you're a very strong student of not only history, but the facts in front of you. So what was going on in Larry Culp's mind during that time?
Early 18, I joined the board thinking I could help. But I think at that point in my fourth year of retirement, what was a very happy retirement, right? Whether it was skiing, fishing, going to a lot of Red Sox games, I had no intention when I joined the board of having a full-time job again, let alone this job. The board ended up being in a position where we were going to effect a leadership change, and I just didn't want the job. I didn't want it in that fashion. But as I talked to a few friends, one that lives not too far from here, Truman Siemens, I think he helped me crystallize what my family knew, and that was I'd had a lifelong fascination with GE, right? This American icon. This clearly was one of the great industrial challenges, at least my generation. And the company's role, not only here in the US, but I would argue in the world, is significant. So you put those three things together to be inside of GE, to tackle this challenge, to have the work matter, right, to our customers and our employees, let alone our investors all around the world. Third time around, I said yes.
And when you walked in, again, I was there, and you started work and you dug into what was really going on, because there's a world of difference between being on the board and being in the coalface every day. Were there moments at the beginning of that journey where you said, oh my God, I had no idea?
Well, I never said that out loud, of course.
No, I mean, to yourself.
But there's no question, right, that 6 months on the board gave me a little bit of information. And you'll recall at the time, so many people said, oh, well, you've been on the board for 6 months. You've got all of this in hand. I mean, I had hypotheses as to where we ought to focus, and I had a sense of how many degrees of strategic freedom we had, at least in the near term. But it was a very steep learning curve. I mean, I had the benefit of being at Danaher for 25 years. I grew up there, right? I spoke the language. I knew everybody. I knew where a lot of the bodies were. But at GE, despite having admired the company for as long as I did and having studied the company in so many different ways, I didn't really know the vocabulary. I didn't know the team. The businesses were similar but different. And we had the crucible of the incredible pressure that we were under, right, given where the company was at the time. So I think about the fall of 2018 with some frequency. I mean, there were some dark days there.
Yes.
But as I went out and talked to customers, they were pulling for us. Not all of them were happy, but they needed GE. They wanted GE to succeed. The team that was on the field when I walked in was a resilient team. They too, right, were committed to the company in so many different ways. And if you're in a situation as challenging as ours was, but you have customers pulling for you and you've got a team on the field ready to fight the good fight, it's hard to not be optimistic.
When I think back to those days together, one of the things that I think you got right most of all at the beginning was prioritization of action. In terms of, there were so many different platforms that were on fire that you could have been distracted by going after one versus the other. But you had a very clear view in the first several days. I remember sitting down and you said, we're going to do this first, and this, and this, and that is how it actually played out. I think that clarity of thought ended up being one of the key determinants for the eventual survival and success of the company.
Definitely. And I think the team heard me talk about some of our behaviors early on, one of which was focus, which implies a prioritization, right, in terms of the things you're going to do and the things that you're not going to do. Because we were in such a difficult situation, everything looked like a crisis, right? And as you know, people were piling on from the outside, right and left. That was, I think, the moment where we just had to slow the game down, take a breath, and really be clear about the order of operations. We knew we had a balance sheet that was hemorrhaging with debt. And at any point in time, we were at risk of having the rating agencies call. We had to avoid that. But the only way to do that was regaining operational control of the business first and foremost. Clearly, we went through a number of other deleveraging actions, but we really needed to make sure we knew what our financial trajectory was, and we needed to begin to operate in a way that would allow us to improve it. And I think that's what we were able to do as 18 became 19, and through the first half of 2019. Didn't mean all those pressures went away, but I think we had a short to-do list, and we could mark progress day by day, week by week accordingly.
There were a couple of occasions at the very beginning where some of the calls were extraordinarily large, in some cases bigger than perhaps the market cap of most companies. We all sat around the room and we worked on it, and you made the decisions, etc. But there had to be moments where you went into a dark room on your own to think about what you were doing, because they were extraordinarily big calls. And unless you were there, you couldn't witness it like I did. And I'm blessed to have witnessed it, because I felt like I was sitting in my own Harvard Business School. And I'd seen a lot by then, but this was different. What was it like to be you during that time? Away from the madding crowd, away from the boardroom, away from all of us who were working for you and with you. And those moments and those nights when you had to make those decisions on your own.
Declan, I go back to that time in my mind and remember acknowledging how fortunate I was to have already been a CEO, as you said earlier, for 14 years, and the CEO of a company where I had different businesses reporting into me. I've long said that the CEO job's different than any other, all the more if you're the CEO of a portfolio of businesses. And that's just a different job But going into GE, I had 14 years of experience and even some experience prior to that running a portfolio. I think that gave me a comfort with respect to so much of what we needed to do that I could draw on that during some of those dark days, particularly when the pressure, the criticism, and the like were palpable. I mean, remember, how many people just gave up on GE?
It's a lot.
Right? People thought the company was going to roll over at some point. Again, I don't want to deny that there were some long nights or some short nights, depending on how much sleep I got. But I think deep down, I had conviction that this was an outstanding company, that we could be better than anybody at the moment thought. And there were people who were depending on us. And as we often talk, right, it's a game of inches. And we didn't win every day, but we won increasingly more days a week. And the cumulative effect of that, I think, gave us room to basically breathe. Now, of course, things changed in 2020 with the pandemic. But by that time, everybody was in a precarious position, right? Just given the uncertainty. And in many respects, that level set things that then allowed us to come out of the pandemic all the stronger.
When did you first begin to realize that this was not about reinvention or rediscovery of the DNA of GE? It was not a combination of those two things. It was one or the other. And that led to the thinking about breaking up the company and doing the things that previously would have been unthinkable for this big grand conglomerate.
I'd been through a lot of acquisitions at Danaher, and thus a lot of change, right? When you go through a change of control, that's one of the biggest catalysts for change that you're ever going to see. And I remember Jack Welch talking about that in one of his books years ago. I always go back to my friend Jim Collins, who talks about preserve the core and stimulate progress. It's not one or the other. You really need to do both. And I think that was the mindset that I had when I went into GE. We had spent the summer of 2018, and some of this is on the public record, right? Talking about various ways in which we might move forward, including the partial IPO of our healthcare business. But I think as the year played out, it became clear we didn't have those degrees of strategic freedom. Again, one thing to talk about that in the abstract in the boardroom, but you think about executing that,
Super hard.
we had a very limited range. But as we worked our way through, I think we were trying to preserve so much of what made GE important for over a century, particularly with respect to our technological prowess and our success in innovation, along with some of the operational improvements that we were making. And of course, the deleveraging was part and parcel of making that turn.
There was this great connection between the American public in particular, not just the American public, but primarily with the GE logo, the light bulb, the refrigerator, Jack Welch, all of these iconic status symbols of really the powerhouse of the American economy, the entire fabric of society. And I remember when you started to close down various businesses that previously people thought unthinkable that would ever happen. And each and every time you did that, because it was the right thing to do for the company, each and every one of those was a moment of reflection where you had to sort of say, I'm doing the right thing, even though not everybody will understand this right now, but they will in time. In particular, the public and the media had lots to say about it at the time, and you knew what you were doing.
Well, it was easy to comment from the cheap seats, right? And there were a lot of people, I think, in the cheap seats at the time. We had to make some tough decisions, but in many respects, I think what was tough about them, Declan, was the specter of history. We had been in a business for a particular period of time. There were a number of people who perhaps had a view that GE would always be in that business, but we didn't have the luxury of perpetuating businesses that we couldn't or shouldn't be in, right? Again, the spirit of focus and driving better operational improvement. But even in around some of the toughest decisions, what I found is when we explained to people not only what we were doing, but why, and make that abundantly clear and acknowledge that maybe there'd be some isolated pain, but we were doing it for the greater good, even with people who had tears in their eyes, understood that this was the right thing for the business, the right thing to serve the greater good. And that was what I think has impressed me all along, going back to Pittsburgh, that first annual meeting, and all the way through, that when you explain the background around a decision to someone who works at GE, they really appreciate that, and they can deal with tough decisions. They can make tough calls themselves. It ultimately is a matter of communication.
I read before that you described somewhere when you saw the company at 140 billion in debt, it was like having a 96-mile-an-hour fastball. But at the same time, one of the things I know you became known for was telling your people to slow down and to be much more thoughtful. When you make a decision, make it, but before you make it, be sure it's the right one. That is a pattern that I've seen in all the things that you've done, which is be fast, be ruthless, be efficient, but at the same time, slow down. To effectuate those dynamic opposites is kind of interesting. What's your thought process around why people should do that?
You can sit in the stands. You can see somebody throw a heater down the middle, see on the scoreboard, it's 96 miles an hour. It's still 96 miles an hour when you're in the batter's box, but it looks a lot faster, right? Especially when it's coming at you. And that's a little bit of what I think I was dealing with as I transitioned from being on the board to being in the chair, to being in the batter's box. With respect to decision making, it was easy to think that, again, everything was a crisis. Our hair was on fire. We needed to move in a number of different directions at pace. And we did, but it was really important for us to slow the game down. Is the famous coach at UCLA, John Wooden, would say, be quick, but don't hurry. So we wanted to make sure that we were clear about the decisions that needed to be made, let's say in the next week or the next month, as opposed to the next 3 or 6 months, and really be thoughtful about how we went about making the critical decisions. Sometimes a B or C decision doesn't need a lot of analysis, and you can be quick to it, you probably can correct it. But the critical decisions, I wanted to make sure we didn't over-rotate on pace and be hasty such that we would make a decision that we would regret in time. So it is a bit of a dichotomy, a juxtaposition in the approach, but I think it helped us because otherwise we would have just been running around reacting to criticism, perhaps taking the bait from a banker rather than determining what was really in the long-term interest of the General Electric company.
So you've earned a reputation for turning around companies that were either in distress or needed to change in order to evolve. So when you step into a place that's struggling like that, you know, what is your personal process for identifying the strengths, the hidden gems?
I think it really is all about just getting out and listening to customers and employees. Lots of ways to do that. Different people who may be on the team, may be third parties, but I like to get out and just get my own feel for what we're doing for customers that they like, that they want us to continue, and frankly, what they don't like or what no one's doing for them that is an unmet need. I think over time, if you are comfortable asking open-ended questions and listening both to what people say and what they don't say, right, you can begin to understand where a company stands in the marketplace. That's with customers. Employees know their company very well. Sometimes information, particularly in large companies, doesn't travel particularly well. Bad news certainly doesn't go northbound very easily. Getting out, developing a reputation for being able to handle the truth tends to unearth a lot of ideas. And some will be big and important, some will be maybe less so. But by sifting through those pieces of the puzzle, what I found is you can pretty quickly put together the mosaic to at least get started, and then repeat that over time and move down the road.
Whenever your name comes up in conversation in rooms when you're not there, and I am, people ask 9 times out of 10 the same question, which is the conglomerate model
Mm.
dead? Is it broke? Is it over? Of course, GE is the poster child for a business that was broken up that once was a conglomerate. But what's your view on that? Are we now living in an era in business where that model, leaving aside the Berkshire Hathaways, which are all anomalies, but in general, do you feel like that model is from the past and not the future?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Berkshire, right? You could look at Amazon as well and say that there are people who make the model work. We did for 25 years at Danaher, right? We did lots of different things as we talked about earlier, and we were very successful during that period of time. But I do think it's challenging, particularly as a company gets larger. I think large companies, particularly multi-industry companies, tend to feed on themselves. You can very quickly focus on internal processes. You can pursue synergies at the expense of the individual businesses and ultimately the customers. I remember early on at GE, I said something out loud. It's one of those moments where I was talking before maybe I was fully thinking through what I was saying. But I said to a group in Crotonville, our training center, I'd gladly forego the mirage of synergy for the tangible benefits of focus, something along those lines. And I joke, I think two people in the back of the room fell over, right? Because they had a view that GE's reason for being was about the synergies, the things that GE could do together. And there was a lot of good there. But at the end of the day, if that doesn't in turn serve a customer, it really doesn't matter that much. And I've just, again, I think the benefit of working for my grandfather and my father growing up and the decentralized orientation of the Danaher approach have long been focused on the individual businesses and the customers they serve. That's an argument for focused businesses as opposed to conglomerates, but there are always exceptions. There are multiple ways to win, Declan.
Something that a lot of people don't know is that even though you're intensely private and don't do a lot of talking about yourself, a lot of CEOs come and talk to you for advice. And that's because of all the things that you've been through. The CEO's role is evolving and changing every day, but it feels to me like in the last 4 or 5 years, it's changed perhaps faster than ever before. How do you view the role of the CEO, and where do you think all that's going in the future, given the amount of time people have to make decisions, et cetera?
I think the context has certainly changed and gotten more challenging, right? I mean, in the digital age, just the clock speed of decisions, media cycles, and the like seems to be measured in nanoseconds. The global game has changed. I mean, business has been increasingly global for decades, but now we're seeing a bit of a balkanization, right, of that. Certainly, we see business in many areas of the world becoming more political. So I think you just put all that together. It's a harder job today, but the essence of the job, and this is what I share with people that I talk to who are in similar roles. You need to make sure, first and foremost, you've got an outstanding team, not an outstanding group of individuals, but an outstanding team. The strategy has to be crystal clear, right, as to what game you're playing and how do you win. And you need to have an operating model will actually help you implement that strategy as opposed to leading everybody to their own devices. That, I think, was true back in 2001 when I first got the Danaher job. And it's the way I think about the job at GE Aerospace today.
Speaking of GE Aerospace, this is the first time in quite a while that you've run a company with one P&L. How is it?
I say it's great because there's just more time to go deep. Go deeper with the team, right? Deeper with products, deeper with customers in a way that can be hard when you're looking after a portfolio. I said the portfolio CEO job is different. You're really managing CEOs, but when you have one business, you can just get so much closer to the team, products, and customers. And for me as an old marketer, right, that is great fun.
You are, without doubt, I think, the best known exponent, stroke embodiment of the principles of Kaizen, certainly in the last 7 years, because, and before that, of course, but certainly people have become very, very focused and aware of that because of how well it's worked inside of GE. You've talked an awful lot about your relationship with Katahira-san,
Yes.
who is obviously somebody you're very close to. Where did you meet him? How did your relationship develop?
You have to go back to 1990, 91, when I had one of the greatest gifts ever. Danaher was working with a firm called Shinjitsu, which was chock full of a bunch of senior Japanese production leaders who had really trained with Taiichi Ono at Toyota and understood the Toyota production system better than anyone. I went to Japan for a week, built air conditioners at a Toshiba facility. And that was really how I began to understand what this idea of Kaizen really was all about. Not so much the idea, but how you would operationalize it day in, day out in a manufacturing environment or in a business environment overall. Katahira-san was one of those consultants, and he's just been a lifelong sensei to me. He continues to push me. He's 78, he's spry, he's tough to keep up with on a factory tour. He was one of the first people I called when I ended up at GE, not because I wanted to replicate what we did at Danaher, Well, when you think about the fundamentals of lean, you think about respect for people, continuous improvement or Kaizen, and a focus on the customer. Nobody knew what that looked like. Nobody knew how to push that broadly through an organization better than Katahira-san.
You said once that you always learn something new every time you meet him.
His eye for opportunity, his eye for pattern recognition, just born of 50 years of experience, is extraordinary. But I think what I have so strongly reinforced is the importance of the people who do the work. He'll come in for a week at one of our factories, and the first thing he'll do is bring all the people who are operators on our shop floor together for a standing ovation.
Have you ever Kaizened yourself?
All the time. All the time.
How do you do that?
I think at a personal level, you get a lot of feedback as a CEO. Some of it you need to work through in terms of what is maybe more accurate than not, what's a priority, what's not. But I'll go through that at a personal level in the wake of a board meeting, a trip out with investors, even the last couple of weeks where we've had a number of internal meetings. And I'll take that feedback, I'll reflect on that and think through, how can I be a better CEO of GE Aerospace in the fourth quarter of this year than I was in the third quarter of this year? And for better or for worse, there are plenty of opportunities.
People who are watching this, who are young CEOs and young leaders, are looking at you saying, what do I need to do in order to become like him? What's your advice to the emerging CEO, the line manager, the person who's trying to become the next president of the firm, of the things they should think about in wanting to evolve into that complete picture that you've become?
These behaviors that I've touched on a couple of times, I really believe are timeless. Now, will the next generation of AI algorithms obsolete the respect for people, this idea of getting better every day or Kaizen, let alone that maniacal focus on customers? I doubt it. So finding ways to make those behaviors your own, right, to make them instinctive, I think will serve anyone well in a business career. What I'd add to that, and I think my own story is a good proof point, you just need reps. It's one thing to talk about leading in a business. It's another thing to actually do it. And in addition to the great gift of going to Japan back in 1990, having the opportunity to lead at a young age, I had my first P&L at Danaher at the age of 30, allowed me to make a lot of decisions, to live with those decisions, figured out what worked, what didn't work, and there were plenty of those, right? And over time, I just accumulated enough reps where I wasn't thinking about some of these decisions in the abstract. I began to have my own gut level view of what would work and what wouldn't. And that served me well when I became CEO at Danaher. And then I think that's certainly carried on to my time at GE. But a lot of people think they can forego those reps, right? I'll continue to consult. I'll do this. I'll do that. I'll get that experience later. I would just encourage people to get it as early as they can and get as much of it as possible.
What has leading GE taught you about yourself that no prior role has?
So much of the approach at GE has been similar to what I learned at Danaher, but it's been at a completely different scale. And it's been with just an exponential increase in public scrutiny and notoriety. So in some respects, whether it's about myself or about the approach, the timeless application of these principles, I think, has been tested and passed that test at scale in a way that I would have never imagined.
We've got two more questions before we finish. One is, given how hard of a grader you are, what grade would you give yourself after all these years?
Well, I mean, just in the last 7 years, right? I think a lot of people would say the stock is up over tenfold from the dark days of the fall of 2018. So that would be a pretty good grade. But I look back and there's things we could have done differently. We could have done better. We could have done sooner. So the stock may be one way to look at it, but there are things we could have done that I wish I had back. I am very pleased with what we as a team at GE Aerospace have done. It's been the thrill of a lifetime to be on this team, to be at the helm. But what we've accomplished wasn't my doing. hundreds of thousands of people all around the world had a hand in it. And I'm just really, really proud to have been part of that in the way that I have.
And the story continues.
We're not done. We're not done.
So could you ever have imagined as that kid in the welding shop all those years ago that you'd end up leading the greatest corporate turnaround in the history of the world?
Never. No, no way. Completely unfathomable.
It's fair to say, and again, I'm saying it, you're not, it's the greatest industrial turnaround in the history of the world. There is no analog for this in business anywhere. If anyone can find one, I'd love to hear from them. And you've been through all of this and you're still working as hard as ever. When you think back to those days when you were in that shed with your father and your grandfather, do you ever think about what they must be thinking now?
I mean, from time to time, right? And I don't even know if my grandfather would relate to GE today and what the company means to the world and what we've done. I think my father would. I would hope they would both be very proud of what we have accomplished. But again, I think it's one thing on the outside to see what has happened to GE. I think a next chapter has been written, or now 3 chapters are being written, right? Good, positive continuations of the story that go back to Edison. But unless you were on the inside, an integral part of this, I think it's hard to appreciate what the team went through. The dark days in 2018, 2019, the pandemic and the like. And that's just why I'm so proud, and I would hope they would be proud, even at a distance, of what we've accomplished. So many people bet against us. And here we are, right? Leading in aerospace. Scott and the team doing a great job in energy at GE Vernova. Pete and company doing very well in healthcare at GE Healthcare. I couldn't be prouder of all 3 businesses. Nothing short of remarkable.
Well, we're excited to see what happens next. Larry, this is the section of Grey Matter which we call the Uncharted path. So we're going to take a walk and I'm going to ask you some quick fire questions to see what you say. So, what's something about you that nobody would ever know that would be interesting for people to know? Or more than one thing?
Well, I think a lot of people probably don't know I'm a big country music fan.
Okay.
Started back in 2013 when my oldest son was going through travel baseball, and we spent a lot of time in the South listening to a lot of country music. So whether it's Old Dominion, Kenny Chesney, Zach Brown, probably one of their biggest fans today.
Really?
Yeah.
You go to concerts?
With some frequency.
Wow, I love that. What's the toughest call you've made where you weren't sure you were right when you were making the decision until after the fact?
I think the toughest decisions are always people decisions, right? Who to promote, who to hire, who you may have to move past. And I think there were some early calls that I had to make that I got wrong. I've learned from that. But when I think about decisions I would like to have back or would have made differently, those are typically the types of decisions.
Have you ever made a decision as a CEO that went against your instincts and afterwards you realized it was the right decision?
Sure. I think one of the reasons I've been able to make better decisions over time is I listen to more people, right? And I can think about some decisions we've just made in the last year, standing up GE Aerospace, where I wasn't altogether convinced that we were making the right decision, but had confidence the folks that were closer to the action knew best. And guess what? They did.
What's a question that you ask yourself before you make a major decision every single time? Like, what is the one thing or 2 or 3 things that you ask yourself when you're there thinking about making a decision like this?
I think it's usually, what will the customer say? What will the customer think? Because in almost any business situation, ultimately, what you do, what you decide has to make sense in front of a customer. It's easy to forget about that when you go through all the hard work, but I like to bring it back to the customer as often as I can.
When did you last change your mind about something important? And what did you learn from it?
I changed my mind, I think, within the last 6 months at GE Aerospace. Again, we've made a lot of organizational moves, and there were some I was uncertain about, where the team had a very strong point of view, convinced me that they were on the right path, and they were.
Can you think of a moment where something you were working on looked like a failure at the time, but ultimately ended up being an accelerator for you? Is there any example like that that particularly strikes you at this time?
Declan, you go back to 93 when I became president at Veeder-Root, the first Danaher operating company that I ran. There were a lot of mistakes that I thought could have been near fatal to my career. I don't think I appreciated it at the time. I was accumulating reps, right? Real decisions I had to live with, some of which I had to fix. And over time, I think I've just learned a lot from that experience in ways that I certainly didn't appreciate in the moment.
What part of your personality have you continuously tried to evolve or keep in check as a CEO during all that time? Given that most people don't know much about you or your personality other than what they see and what they hear and what they read.
Declan, I have to say, as a CEO, you know this, there are lots of opportunities to become unmoored. People will treat you very well, even when they don't mean to. I think getting back to the shore, being in a place like this with family and friends has always served just to help keep me grounded, even though I've been a CEO now for, over 20 years.
And what's the best piece of advice you've ever received and the best piece of advice you outright rejected?
Well, I think the best advice I ever got was from my friend Tony Saccone.
Okay.
He said simply, trust your gut. And I think he gave me the confidence as I grew in my career to do just that. And I think about that all the time. Maybe some of the worst advice probably comes from the bankers who will tell you something is appropriately priced. It may well be a bargain. Sometimes that's true, often it's a value trap.
Good old bankers. If you could pass one lesson to your eventual successor, whenever that is in the future, at a human level, as opposed to a business level, what would that be? Just one.
Ask good questions and listen aggressively. It's what keeps you tied into what matters most in terms of customers and the people who work for the business.
We're finishing this walk in front of a historic GE sign. What's the history to this sign?
Declan, I'm told this was outside our electric meter factory in Somersworth, New Hampshire, decades ago. It had been relocated to our corporate campus, our training campus in Crotonville, New York. As you know, when we went through the transformation, we ended up selling that real estate. This was about to be cut up and sold for scrap. I caught wind of that and said, time out, I'll send a truck up. And again, just given my affinity for all things GE, I wanted to make sure we retain a little bit of that history. I'm glad we're able to find a place for it here.
Well, it's in this beautiful place. It deserves its spot. And it represents, I think, everything we've been talking about for the last couple of hours. Thank you for sharing your day. Thank you for sharing your memories. And thank you for sharing your experience. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Declan. Good to be with you.
Thank you.